This commenter asked if I could talk more about positive hyperarousal, and I asked for clarification on what that meant, and they said, "My dog nips and bites her favorite people when they come over. It obviously causes her a lot of internal conflict. She tries to self-soothe, but she just has a lot of big feelings." So first, I want to clarify a difference between hyperarousal and a fidget fawn response. Hyperarousal is a term that we might use to talk about dogs who are chronically higher on the stress scale. So if you picture our stress scale, green, yellow, orange, red, they might baseline in like a yellow or an orange, much like a dog with an anxiety disorder, but they aren't anxious. But their body is constantly being triggered closer and closer to fight or flight. They have a much smaller window of tolerance because of that before they're triggered into that red zone state. And they may also struggle with resilience to stress and self-soothing, self-regulation, coping with stress. These dogs are often mistaken for being overexcited, but they are not having a good time, and this is not only going to be harmful to them in terms of behavior, but also mental, emotional, and physical health. Existing at that level of stress is not healthy. That is different, though, from a fidget response. Now, a dog who is hyper-aroused could still display a fidget response, but one does not need to be hyper-aroused to fidget. So you could see a fidget response from a dog who is not dysregulated at all. They may just be having some big feelings in the moment, or from a dog with an anxiety disorder or a trauma. The fidget response is open to all. So the fidget response, and I also want to talk about the fawn response, are two responses that we can see up in the red zone, just like fight or flight or freeze, but they are often mistaken for being more positive. Sometimes we miss entirely that the dog is in distress. Now, one quick caveat here, you can see all of these survival responses lower on the stress scale. So for example, in the yellow zone, where we are still closer to, let's say, the parasympathetic nervous system than the sympathetic nervous system, and you have a dog who is trying to cope with the stress that they're feeling, you could see flight, but we call it avoidance. So I want to clarify that here, just for ease of communication, I'm going to be talking about those survival responses that are happening higher up on the stress scale, what we tend to think of as fight or flight or freeze. And I'd like to introduce you to fawn and fidget. Fidget often also looks like overexcitement. It can involve nipping or biting, but it can also often look a lot like just jumping and licking, fast, frantic, fidgety behaviors. You're going to notice in body language signs of stress, long lips pulled back, panting from an elevated heart rate, big eyes, excessive shedding or dander, a scooped tongue, a furrowed brow perhaps. You're going to notice that a dog in this state is probably not interested in food. Their fine motor skills are offline. They are having trouble or unable to process information like their name. These dogs are not having a good time. They are often conflicted. I tend to see fidget and fawn more often when the dog, for example, maybe really likes people but doesn't want them to touch them, or really likes getting cookies at the vet's office but is also really worried about what's going to happen there. I want to talk briefly about the fawn response as well, because sometimes fidget and fawn show up together, and that can also be really confusing. Fawn is another one that doesn't translate well between the species. Fawn is like people-pleasing in humans. So you'll actually see the dog getting, right up in the person's space. You might see them frantically requesting to be touched or petted. Again, these are going to be fast, frantic movements. They might be making themselves small, curling into themselves, lowering themselves down, and it can be combined with fidget. So they can be doing that as there's a lot of jumping, licking, fast, frantic motions. I think I misspoke a second ago. Fawn doesn't have to be fast and frantic, but if combined with fidget, that's what you might see. It's really important to recognize both of these states as a dog who is struggling and does not feel safe in their body. Their sympathetic nervous system is engaged. We are in a near identical state of fight or flight for all intents and purposes. It's just being displayed differently. And so these dogs need space from the trigger just as much as a dog who's in fight does, or a dog who's in flight. And that's for their own well-being and for safety reasons. And so a dog who's fidgeting or fawning when visitors come over, I'm going to create some space in the same way I would if I had more like obvious stranger danger. So I might put my dog behind a barrier. I might have them on leash with me. I might have them outside. I might start with greetings outside if that's easier for them. There are a bunch of options depending on what works best for the individual dog. Some dogs, especially when we're looking at dogs with dysregulated nervous systems, are going to struggle with separation or different pieces like that. So we have to craft a management plan that works well for the individual dog so that we're not just creating a different stress. And then it really depends on what the dog needs. I might want to figure out what that conflict is for the dog. For a lot of dogs, it's I like people, but I don't want them to touch me. And that can be confusing to people when the dog is jumping all over you and touching you. So I might be doing like some pattern games or some engage, disengage, or some calming enrichment like sniffing, licking, chewing while the visitors come in. And then when I see that my dog is in a lower state of arousal and I've helped them get there, then we might move on to the next step. I might do something like some treat retreat, or maybe at that point my dog is okay to go up and approach, but I'm asking people not to touch or to only touch with consent. It's really going to depend on the individual dog, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that you really want to behave as if your dog is going to go into fight in the sense of really comprehending what a difficult time the dog is having, and that just because they're going closer doesn't mean that they are comfortable being that close.